Hey, everybody. Welcome to In the Know with Nina. I'm your host, Dr. Nina Crowley. I'm the Director of Clinical Education and Partnerships at SICA, where we partner with healthcare providers to offer body composition solutions. Today, I'm joined with Dr. Grant Tinsley. He's Director of the Energy Balance and Body Composition Laboratory and Associate Professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Sports Management at Texas Tech University. And if you know anything about body composition, you've heard his name. So I'm really excited to have you on here today to help me dispel some of the myths that we hear about body composition, get really in depth with some of the things that people are asking me about. So really, I'm kind of cheating by having you help explain things in your way to help me make my job a little bit easier.
Well, no, thank you for having me. I'm happy to hopefully make your job just a bit easier by having some of those conversations.
Great. Well, yeah. So, one of the biggest things I wanted to pick your brain about is really help our listeners sort out some of the terminology about body composition. I know these days, especially, one of the things I hear a lot about in the research study, particularly with obesity and medications, is I really see people not understanding the difference between fat free mass, lean body mass, and skeletal muscle mass. And I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions in that category, but I'd love to sort of hear your, big level thoughts on how do we get people to understand what those are a little bit better and how to assess them.
It's a fantastic question, and I'll start by saying if any listeners confused by those terms, they're not alone because even in the scientific literature, those terms are used a little bit inconsistently. So we actually have a couple papers under review right now that have whole tables dedicated to just very precise definitions of some of these body compartments, just to try to get even us researchers on the same page with what we're truly talking about. So I'll start by saying, without going into too much detail, that there are multiple ways we can describe body composition. And really, all of body composition assessment is trying to understand what our body mass is composed of. We have this understanding that just looking at someone's body mass is not the most informative metric when we're trying to understand what's going on internally and how that relates to other things like health and function. So many methods of body composition assessment will use what's called the molecular level of assessment. And this is just where you're trying to split all of body mass up into different categories of molecules. So this is not based on anatomy. This is not trying to separate our specific skeletal muscles we might be able to, not literally see, but tell where they are anatomically. We can feel certain ones exercising. We have some knowledge of them. That's not what the molecular level is. We're looking at the molecules of fat, for example, wherever they occur in your body. And that sum of that estimated mass of fat molecules would be fat mass. If you subtracted away the fat mass from your body mass, then everything else that's left is fat-free mass. So that includes protein, which we sometimes think of, but includes water, which is our largest molecular component. It includes bone mineral, glycogen, some other small unmeasured components. So if someone's talking about their fat-free mass, we're not just talking about their skeletal muscle. We're talking about all these different types of molecules. And again, not in a specific anatomical location, just throughout the entire body. What people tend to think in terms of is anatomy because it's a little bit more understandable. But that's a different level of assessment called the organ tissue level. And this is where we'd be splitting up body parts based on their anatomy and certain types of tissue or organs like skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, and so on. And to really quantify these, we really need certain imaging techniques or else validated equations that were based on these imaging techniques. But yeah, as you mentioned, in the literature and just in popular dialogue, we'll often see these conflated, where we might be looking at the results of a research study and see that there was a decrease in fat-free mass. And then people are assuming that means people actually lost skeletal muscle mass specifically, and that's not always the case.
Yeah, it's definitely, especially when we're talking about, 25 to 40% of someone's, weight loss, that can be a really big difference if we're talking about fat-free mass versus muscle.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's a very important issue. I'm waiting for an acceptance email on an article that we really dive into this, actually in the context of GLP-1 drugs, just on the interpretation of how we're interpreting the results from some of these studies, because
Oh, great.
it is important to get down into these details so that people have the appropriate level of concern. Not that we shouldn't have some level of concern to make sure we're not losing functional tissue during weight loss, but the devil is in the details on these interpretations.
Right. Well, so it's kind of speaking about terms, another one that I hear a lot of is a lot of people throwing around gold standard. And so I really, thought maybe you could give me a background on, what really is the gold standard if we're looking at measuring someone's fat mass and if we're looking at measuring someone's muscle mass. How do we know what is the real gold standard, and then kind of the difference between what you would do in a lab to say, get that gold standard measurement versus what we can validate something that's more practical in the clinic to use and actually, kind of give someone quicker feedback, and how do we kind of reconcile those two?
Yes, I'm very uncomfortable using the term gold standard. And I think the further someone goes, if you feel like people who spend a lot of time looking at body composition assessment, probably they are much more hesitant to use the words gold standard than, others. So I won't name names. There's a company, it's not in bioimpedance, that actually named their device the gold standard, which I think is very probably confusing to people. But yeah, so the scientific term equivalent of the gold standard we often use would be something like a criterion method or a reference method. And there are some of those, but it's important to point out, and I'll give an example. So magnetic resonance imaging, for example, is often viewed as a criterion or reference method for organs and tissues, like we were just talking about. So skeletal muscle mass, adipose tissue. But even it has limitations. There's kind of a joke in body composition that really the only true way to measure someone's body composition is to dissect their cadaver, either physically or chemically, because then you're truly measuring the exact thing you're looking at. But everything else, there is some, I don't want to say guesswork, but there's some assumptions involved, and there's some limitations to every technology, including the ones we just kind of arbitrarily choose as the most accurate. So with that kind of caveat, that disclaimer out of the way, yeah, typically magnetic resonance imaging or potentially computed tomography as imaging techniques would be what we'd view as these criterion methods for the tissue organ level. For the molecular level of body composition, which again is just dividing up the molecules of the body into these different categories, typically for whole body values, we'd be looking at what's called a multi-compartment model. And this is something that's built by multiple different assessments. We would get a validated body volume assessment, validated body mass assessment, which is the easy part, typically bone mineral assessment. And then again, a really important component is the total body water, because that is our largest molecular component. So if we pull each of those values into these equations that were validated using these very high-tech atomic level techniques back in the day, we have this equation where we can get the output being these multi-compartment model, often four-compartment model body composition metrics. So those are kind of in an ideal research setting, and they even have their challenges there to use in a research setting. But those are certainly not accessible to individuals. So if you're moving down from these criterion assessments, we have kind of a whole category of laboratory grade assessments, which would include things like DEXA. It would include things like professional bioimpedance, air displacement plethysmography, underwater weighing. Some of these techniques that are more accessible in research labs, and they might be accessible to some individuals if they have the right types of testing facilities. But then, practically speaking, for many individuals or even clinics that are trying to implement testing, they might have to move further down the road to something like, simple manual anthropometry or less expensive bioimpedance scales. 3D scanning applications have gained some traction here. So it's kind of a spectrum of accessibility, and of course, the costs involved are very different across this spectrum. So that would be my view of kind of an overview of working all the way down from these criterion methods down to inexpensive methods that individual consumers might be able to access at home.
I love that. And I think the accessibility component is really important. As we're talking about, even we talk a lot about how treatments can be accessible, but even body composition. And that comes up for us a lot as people say, what's the return on investment and can we get reimbursement for it? So I do hope one day we have that, which could make that decision a little bit easier for folks when they're looking at how they're going to get reimbursed for that. But another, so as you mentioned, the DEXA is one that I hear a lot about because I think that for a long time was something that people are used to referring folks to get a bone density test done. And so that's something that we hear, oh, that does body comp too. I know you probably have a nice, easy way to say that, but I know not every DEXA scanner can give body composition results, and there's some limitations there as well, and not super accessible. And there's some things that make that difficult. But I do hear a lot of clinical folks kind of talking about like the DEXA like it is a gold standard in a clinical setting. So do you have any kind of ways to handle that conversation?
Yeah, I think I don't think it's correct to say that DEXA is the gold standard. It is a great technique. It has lots of pros. It has some cons as well, which we can discuss. You're correct that it depends on the specific type of scan whether you get useful composition information. So, you would need a total body scan, which does provide with your overall bone mineral density, but there are also more specific scans conducted at high risk fracture sites like the hip and the wrist. So there might be times someone's getting a bone assessment done via DEXA and they don't necessarily get their total body composition, or that's not accessible. For the total body composition, yeah, again, this is not truly a gold standard. You get a two-dimensional image, so you get these pixels. It has the advantage that it is an imaging technique. So there's some interesting anatomical information. You can get down to segmental body composition, like separating, the limbs from the trunk and so on. So that's an advantage, but it is a 2D image, and there's some estimation involved. So just a little bit about how DEXA works. It has two different energies of X-rays, and it can essentially do a comparison or kind of a splitting of body mass into two compartments at a time. So in one comparison it can make is kind of locating the pixels on this image that contain bone versus those that do not contain bone. And then in the pixels that do not contain bone, it can separate out into fat and lean tissue. But for these pixels that contain bone, there's a little bit of guesswork involved on the actual composition there. And it's up to 40% of the pixels on a scan that have some bone. So I wouldn't say we're guessing, but there are algorithms to kind of predict what the body composition probably is in those pixels that have bone. And that's not a perfect science. So there is some error involved in that inherently, that you're looking at a 2D image, and if there's bone pixel there, you know a little bit less about the body composition. There are also some challenges on the actual size. So the two best DEXA manufacturers, they have models that can accommodate fairly large body sizes, but there's still plenty of individuals who may be too wide or too tall to truly fit into the scanning dimensions. So there are some disadvantages there where you'll have to assume, for example, you sort of cut off in the image someone's right arm and leg, and then you're kind of mirroring the other side, or vice versa if you're cutting off the left side. So there's some error involved there where you're just kind of assuming that someone has a symmetrical body composition. But yeah, from the biggest picture perspective, again, I would say that to truly have a gold standard method at this level assessment used by DEXA, you really need a couple different techniques combined. So there are many studies out there that try to use DEXA as a gold standard to develop a new method, and that's generally frowned upon by, I don't know, those of us who are like very deep into the body composition research. There might be times it's necessary, or you want to just look at the agreement of DEXA and a more accessible method. But I wouldn't view it as truly a criterion or reference standard.
Wow, that was really well said. I'm gonna have to remember that, but it really understandable too. So I think that's I'm really excited to have some of our providers listen to that. And then another, I think you could probably do a really high level overview maybe of what bioimpedance is in a clinical setting and how we're using that. I know I talk a lot about it from our perspective, but I know you're bringing this sort of agnostic level to all the companies and you've looked at all of them. So sort of in general, what can you tell us about bioimpedance and how we're able to kind of decide that that's accurate or precise enough to use when we're in a clinic?
Yeah, so this is, I'm glad we're talking about after DEXA, because there's a huge contrast here that's important. And for DEXA, there are two, arguably three manufacturers, essentially, of major devices. Two of them, at least, are very high quality. They're not identical, but they're similar. There's some barriers to entry into producing these X-ray emitting devices. If you contrast that with bioimpedance, there's an enormous diversity. So whereas the DEXA scanners manufacturer to manufacturer are are more similar, and there are only a few options. In bioimpedance, there's an enormous spectrum from $20 devices you could get on Amazon or Walmart up to, 30,000 plus dollar devices that are professional research grade devices. So I think anytime, for example, if you hear anyone making kind of broad conclusions about bioimpedance as a category, you really can't do that because it's not comparable at all. Just taking some cheap electrodes and throwing them into a scale and having someone throw an equation together, as is done in these at home device, some of the at home devices. It's not fair to compare that to the professional grade devices. And I can't recall if you know this. You certainly didn't bring me on because of this, but I've had one of the professional Sika devices ever since I started my lab here for 8 years. And one of the reasons I chose that over competitors was because of the scientific validation. So, for example, on the high end here, and again, this is the Sika model. This was the 515. But the algorithms for body composition were developed and validated using a multi-compartment model, a 4-compartment model like I was just discussing. There's also MRI validation of the skeletal muscle mass estimates. There was dilution techniques, which we may not get into here, but those would be the criterion standard for body fluids. There is validation data there. And this was actually published, which is something I really admire because, some manufacturers, there's very little information that's actually available for a researcher or clinician to review to kind of establish the accuracy of the device. So again, Dr. Crowley did not pay me to say that, but just as an example of a well-validated device, it's certainly not, fair to compare a professional grade device like that to a consumer device. But zooming out, broadly, all of these technologies will share the fact that they are trying to estimate body composition from tissue responses to an injected electrical current, knowing some information about what is injected and then what is received at these kind of receiving electrodes. So there's a physiological rationale here, understanding that the way individual tissues and fluids respond to these electrical currents says something about kind of the relative proportion of these tissues. So it's a positive of this category in general, again, with the caveat that, a device using a single frequency in an at-home scale may not be able to tease out some of those body composition implications of the data the same way a professional device could, which typically uses more electrodes and more frequencies. So in contrast to just a handheld device or just a foot-to-foot device like a normal scale, the professional grade devices will often, one, be both bilateral, so they have electrodes in contact with the left and right side of the body, and then they would also have upper body and lower body electrodes. So that's a strong aspect of the professional analyzers is you're seeing, quote unquote, the entire body. The different frequencies have implications for kind of what fluid compartments are being captured. So as these devices use a range from very low to very high frequencies, it allows kind of better designation of fluids and tissues. And again, I think for bioimpedance, it's critical on kind of the data side that the scientists developing the algorithms, for lack of a better term, know what they're doing. And from evaluating these at-home scales, we've seen some where, the hardware is very similar, but one device from a, reputable manufacturer actually provides okay estimates, whereas the other is just terrible estimates, worse than not having an estimate because the equations are just not developed properly. So again, just to reiterate, it's a very diverse category with some great, very high quality devices and some that are rather poor. So it deserves kind of a more nuanced look than some of these other technologies.
It's so nuanced. That's why it makes it so hard to just really summarize it in a couple sentences. So, I mean, that was a beautiful explanation. And I think another component of the equations that we use is looking at some of the differences just naturally in body composition between gender and age and ethnicity. And so that is an area where I've been happy to know, that that's a component in some of our formulas. And so I don't know if I'm sure that you have dove into those among other devices where, people will say, hey, you get on there and you change your gender or you change your ethnicity and the number stays the same. Why wouldn't we want that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And it is, this is true of kind of any equations, but certainly with bioimpedance that you do want an equation that was developed in a similar population. So I understand why some people might think they want an equation that's agnostic to those factors, but in reality, to get accurate data for yourself, you want kind of the correct equation being applied. So, like you're mentioning, within these higher quality devices, there's decision tree, so to speak, of based on these parameters you enter, it routes you to the correct equation, and then it's still using your data to predict your body composition. It's just using the equation that best matches the characteristics that you've provided, the information you've provided to the device.
Yeah, that's definitely a component there, and how we're giving people the results too. Giving people sometimes really want a set number, like what should my body fat percentage be? And I'm impressed with your recent work on helping people figure out all the different nuanced equations that there are out there and ways to estimate your body fat percentage and other body comp data. But it's a tough one, right? I think sometimes our quest to have a cutoff and a number is sometimes too simplified.
No, I agree. And, it's interesting that we have all these diverse technologies that are assessing different components of the body, but then we kind of end up at the same metrics like body fat percentage. And, that's kind of another interesting feature. Each technology has something like this, but bioimpedance, I think, is particularly strong in this area, that there's some interesting information that can be obtained from kind of the raw data that's actually measured. So things like phase angle, that is, it there are people might have trouble defining what exactly it is, but we know that there are relationships with health, with morbidity, mortality, and so on, and that it's some type of non-invasive cellular health marker. There's some components like that that you get from bioimpedance that you can't get from other devices that are interesting. So I think beyond just moving everything towards body fat percentage and fat-free mass and these common metrics, we can kind of, with the given technology, capitalize on its unique features and kind of some of the physiological under the hood items it's actually taking a peek at.
Oh, I love that. I do, because I think even though we're still trying to struggle to get people away from BMI and weight, still, I think the next target tends to be then body fat percentage, right? And I know I've been very happy to have other measures in the fat compartment of like visceral adipose tissue estimates that are a lot more helpful to actually connect someone's health to these measurements. And then, of course, the whole area of muscle mass assessment, I think people are kind of finally waking up to that being probably more important than assessment of that adiposity.
Yeah, I think that's very, certainly very important. And it's nice, again, some of these professional bioimpedance analyzers not only provide fat-free mass, but some, such as Sika's, have MRI validated skeletal muscle equations. So, kind of presenting the body in multiple ways, kind of this traditional way with the molecular categories, but also with some validated equations for these actual tissues of interest like skeletal muscle. And then, of course, like you mentioned this some with the visceral adipose tissue, but with the multiple electrodes on each side and upper and lower body, we can also tease out some of the segmental data if you're trying to look at things like appendicular skeletal muscle, specifically in the different regions of the body, which has a range of applications from clinical to athletics and fitness and so on.
Yeah, I love that. Well, yeah. So my last question is kind of maybe more something that you're doing in your lab or that you know of that's happening. But I really hear a lot of people asking about, we like bioimpedance for a single assessment, but we really want to know is how accurate or how good is it at measuring changes over time, especially as we're looking at change in people, significant weight changes and evaluating, what components of the body are changing. How do we look at change over time with bioimpedance or any other technology?
Yeah, so I would say that if you were trying to evaluate changes over time, your standardization and your best practices before assessments become absolutely critical. If you're just trying to get a general sense of someone's body composition, you might, you still should pay some attention to it, but it might be a little bit less important if you standardize that they're rested, that they're fasted, that you've controlled their fluid intake, all of these items. Because even if there's some error involved in that single assessment, you can still get a ballpark to tell them, you potentially have adiposity that's consistent with health, or maybe it's not as consistent with health, and there's some items we want to work on. You can get that general look at it. If you're trying to track changes over time, changes are often fairly small. Now, in some cases, that may not be true. For example, like with current GLP-1 treatment, we have much larger changes that give you a little bit of grace in this area.
Mm.
But nonetheless, if you're tracking changes over time, it's just very important that you minimize all the error you can. And by error, I just mean the biological noise in the body caused by activities of daily living. So this is true for most methods, but certainly for bioimpedance, because it's very sensitive physiologically, which is good. It can detect differences in these physiological components, but it also means if you're not careful in preparing this patient for assessment, that there could be some noise there that would be tricking, I wouldn't say tricking the device, but just causing an error that it might throw off those initial values and make it harder to track accurately. So that's a big thing I would say, rested overnight. So no recent exercise or physical activity, ideally fasted overnight, even controlling fluid intake. And this relates to understanding the technology, but these modern professional analyzers do have a built-in body mass scale. So anything you're doing that will trick the body mass. So for example, if you chugged a bunch of water before you stepped on, that will artificially increase your body mass. So then when things like fat mass, fat-free mass, skeletal muscle mass, all these are estimated from that body mass metric, there'll be some error baked into them. Then if you come in for another assessment down the road and you don't do that same thing, you don't chug a bunch of water, there could be some artificial changes that aren't reflective of the real changes we're trying to track. So this is true of any method, but certainly applies to the modern bioimpedance scales that you can maximize your data quality just by being fairly meticulous on the preparation. And these are not extreme things, but just having a consistent procedure in place where you're providing this guidance to your patients, and even just explaining a little bit about why it's important. This will help us get the most accurate data for you so that we can track these changes carefully over time. If you don't do that and don't standardize, you're much more likely to be confused by the data at some point, where you'll have had some values that are artificially high for some metric, and now they appear artificially low, and it seems like you've had this huge change. But then at the next assessment, it's back up. And just some of this noise can lead to confusion, really, when you're tracking over time. But I would say that, yeah, certainly the professional grade bioimpedance devices can track over time. We've done a number of analyses with these, and other labs have as well, that they're certainly able to do this. But again, like any technology, you just want to maximize your data quality so you're more confident in these changes you're seeing.
I love the way you put that. I really am going to steal a lot of these clinical pearls, because I think our providers, when they're ready to use body composition analyzers in their clinic, then sometimes they get stuck on those type of issues when the patients are like, what do I do with these numbers that are different, and they can't explain it, and people think their actual body composition is changing more rapidly or more dramatically than it might actually be. So I think that's really super helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. And I always share the anecdote that, like when I go in just for my annual physical, I go in January and I'm wearing like boots and jeans and a bunch of stuff in my pockets and jacket. And they try to have me step on the scale. I'm like, do you want me to take off like any stuff? They're like, oh no, just step on. So I step on, and it's not my accurate body mass. I haven't even removed like all the accessories. So, but that's what they're capturing. So, I mean, the same goes for body composition on, standardizing the clothing, the approximate time of day, these procedures. Again, it doesn't have to be overly onerous where it's down to the minute. You're exactly at the same point and you ate exactly the same diet the same, the day before. But just attention to some of those details really can maximize your data quality, and ultimately will help you in the end, because it'll lead to hopefully less confusion and clearer interpretation of what you're actually trying to track.
Absolutely. Well, I think this was one of my favorite conversations, so I really appreciate your time. How can people follow your work, and where do we follow you the closest?
Yeah, so a couple places online, I'll share information about our research and projects we're working on. So one is my website, which is just my name, granttinsley.com. And then I'll also share information about published research from our lab, both on LinkedIn, just under my name, Grant Tinsley, and then on Instagram. And there my handle is Grant_Tinsley_PhD. So those would be the main places to connect or follow my lab's work.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and hope we can stay in connection in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks.